Astro is mostly known as a static site generator, but did you know you can use it to build a full backend as well? In this video, let's see how you can build a full backend API with Astro and a few other cool technologies that we'll talk about along the way. What's up, everyone? My name is James Q Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. If you're interested in following any of the things that I do, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel or check out my newsletter where I send weekly updates, and you can find that on my site at jamesqquick.com. And if you've already followed me for any amount of time, you've probably heard me talk about one of my favorite frameworks now, which is Astro. And most people think about Astro as just being a static site generator, but it's actually a full stack framework that directly competes with things like Next.js and SvelteKit, etc. So I want to help raise awareness to the fact that you can build backend APIs with Astro in a very similar fashion to how you would with some of these other more well-known full stack frameworks. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to build that backend in Astro using API endpoints inside of Astro, or server endpoints. We're going to integrate that with a Xata database. We're going to actually be able to use Xata to generate TypeScript types and do some other cool stuff, which is really neat. We'll test all of these using the Postman extension inside of VS Code. And then we'll kind of wrap this up and talk about additional resources where you can take Astro to the next level at the end of this video. So hopefully that works well for you. Let's go ahead and dive on in. All right, so I'm going to start on the Getting Started page with Astro, and this is instructions on how to set up a brand new Astro project, which is basically just one command that will run in the terminal. So this is going to run an npm create command, and it's going to tell it to use the latest version of Astro. So Astro actually has a really amazing onboarding experience here where they have this really neat animated UI, including Houston, which is the mascot for Astro, which I think is really neat. I'm going to call this project Astro API Demo. We can include some sample files. We don't really need this, but we can do that just to kind of show you some of the basics of what's here. And then we can let it go ahead and install the dependencies through npm. So we'll let it run that. And then we'll come back in a second when that's done. All right, so those dependencies have finished installing. In this case, we are going to use TypeScript. That's kind of part of what we're going to be doing in this demo. We can use the strict recommended strictness of TypeScript, and then we can initialize this as a new Git repository if we want to. It'd be beneficial for you to do that if you want to deploy this to Netlify or Vercel, etc. at the end, and I'll actually show you a resource where you can go and figure out how to do that at the end of this video as well. So we have our new project created. I'm going to open that up in the same VS Code window that I'm in, and I'm going to do that with the code -r command. So -r says reuse the window that I'm already in. And in this case, I want to open up this API demo. It's going to open it up in VS Code. All right, so we have this project created for us. Now we can go ahead and run this with npm run dev. And kind of neat, they run this at localhost 4321, which is like 4321 blast off, Astro, astronaut, space, etc. So here's kind of the starter application. If we look inside of here, you can see there's a pages directory where we have file-based routing. There's components like you would expect. There's layouts, etc. We're actually not going to get into any of that stuff in this video. We're going to focus on the API endpoint aspect. If you're interested in learning more about how Astro works, I have a crash course that you could watch on YouTube as well to dive more into those features. But in the meantime, let's actually go over to the Astro documentation for server endpoints. And so for Astro, you have the ability to kind of enable SSR in your project to be able to run things on the server when request comes in. So by default, everything is handled statically, but you have the option to go and enable SSR to then be able to run things on the server. Now, this is fairly straightforward. What we need to do is change the output to server inside of our Astro config file, and that'll kind of take care of everything for us to run locally. All right, so I'm going to copy this property, and then I'll come back and I'll open the Astro config file and then just paste this into the config. So now this is going to be running with a server configuration where we're going to be able to take advantage of server endpoints. I don't know if this will automatically handle that change and restart successfully, so I'm going to go ahead and manually restart this myself. So then we can kind of look at the documentation for server endpoints, and we start with basically the idea of creating a file inside of our pages directory, again, file-based routing, that's going to represent our API endpoint, and then we can define different methods inside of this. So the data that we're going to work with in this case is going to be jobs. It's going to be kind of a dummy developer jobs API. So let's create a folder inside of pages called jobs, and then we'll create an index.ts file. Now, basically, this is going to be the root route handler for /jobs. And actually, I want to put this inside of another directory called API. So it should be /API/jobs. And then inside of that, we have our index.ts file. Notice this is .ts, not .astro, because we're not doing a front-end component here. This is server-side code only inside of index.ts. Now from here, we can keep this a little bit simpler, but let's just copy in the sample project that they give us, or the sample code snippet that they give us. And let's keep this again really simple. So let's just stringify an object with a message property that says hello world. And I'm going to give us a little more space here. And let's kind of get rid of all of this code inside of here as well. So what you'll notice is inside of this file, we are exporting a function with the key name of get. So this is obviously going to handle get requests that are sent to /API/jobs. In a second, we'll create the post route, and then we'll create update and delete routes as well. This also destructures a parameter called params. In this case, we're not going to use that, so we can actually get rid of that for now and just not worry about what that parameter is. So what we should be able to do is now we should be able to come over to localhost 4321 /API/jobs and then get back some sort of hello world message to be able to show us that this API route is working. Now, instead of going back and forth for the browser to test this, and specifically when we get into post requests, I'm going to use the Postman extension in VS Code to be able to test these HTTP requests. The Postman extension is just like you're used to in the Postman application, where you can enter in a new URL. Let's just create a new request here. You can tell it where you want to send the request, 4321 API/jobs. And in this case, you can send this and we can see the response all inside of here as well. And we can kind of tab back and forth between our code and this to be able to test this, which is really nice. We'll also be able to test this with our other requests for post and put and delete, and test sending body information to that as well, which is really nice. So now we have kind of a hello world endpoint working. Let's now switch over to talk a little bit about Xata, which we're going to use for our database. So Xata is a serverless database platform that's powered by Postgres. It's one of my favorite options for these demos and for building things in general. It's like the easiest thing to work with because you get a visual editor for your database, and then they generate types for you, which is really, really nice. So if you wanted to follow along with this, you need to create a free, totally free account on Xata and then create a database. And then I'm going to start with a database that I've already created. So inside of my workspace, these are a few of the different databases that I've created. If you're creating this from scratch, you can go to add database, give it a name, select a region, and create. It's fairly straightforward. So inside of my JQQ job board database, I have one table. Again, if you're starting from scratch, you can add an empty table. And then I have a few different properties about the actual job posts themselves. So the location, the link, the company that they're at, and the title, and then the type, so full-time as an example. These are probably a little outdated, but a couple of companies that I would look for if you're looking for jobs are Xata themselves. Daily.dev and Clerk.dev are some awesome companies to check for job opportunities to see if they're available. So this is the data that we're going to work with. And they have some nice things in here where they have like a JavaScript snippet generator, and they show you how to do some of the different things inside of Xata, etc. But one of the coolest things we're going to do is use the Xata CLI to generate TypeScript types for us inside of our project. So if you were to follow along with this, you would run this install command for the Xata CLI. And then once you have that set up, you can come to your terminal and maybe open a new terminal window and use the Xata init command. So basically what this is going to do, in this case, prompt me to log in because I don't have my environment variable set. So that may be the first step. So let's actually do that first. So I'm going to run Xata auth login. And then in my case, I'm going to use the force flag to override an existing API key because I kind of wiped them out behind the scenes. You can just do Xata auth login and get that API key. So I'm going to create a new API key in the browser. This should open up the browser window. I'm going to give a name for this, the Astro API demo. We'll create an API key, and I think these can't have spaces. So we'll do this. So Astro API demo says this tab is all set. If we go back to our terminal, it has now taken that environment variable, added it to our setup here. So now we're configured to work with Xata, or logged in, authenticated with Xata. So from here, we can run Xata init, and it's going to ask us which project we want to connect to. So we want to connect to, in my case, the job board. And then it's going to say, hey, if we generate code for you, what kind of code do you want? So I'm going to type TypeScript because that's what we're doing in here. And then I'll choose the default of a Xata TS file for generating that code. And this is going to be really, really cool. You'll see this in a second. This is like my favorite feature of Xata is if we come into our source code when this is finished, it's running a codegen function. So two things. There's a Xata RC file, which is a config object to show like which database we're connected to, and then where the source TypeScript file is. And then inside of that TypeScript file, we can see that it generates definitions for all of our tables and then creates inferred types that we can work with to have TypeScript types for our data. And then it also creates our Xata client. So then we can just get access to this by calling the get Xata client from anywhere inside of our application to be able to reference our actual client, which is really neat. What this will look like is in now our get function, we can import the get client or get Xata client function. So I get an automatic import up there. And then we can get this. So we can say client equals get Xata client. All right, so now that we have a reference to this client, we could come into our handler and we could say const, if I can type correctly, we can say const jobs, and then we're going to await using our client. So clients.db dot, and then cool thing, we get IntelliSense for the tables that we can query. So .job, and then we'll call .get all. So this is going to get us all the jobs that are inside of this, inside of our database. The other thing we might want to do is do a little bit of try catch. So if something goes wrong with this query, what do we actually do? I think I selected the wrong line. So let's move this code down here. So we run the query inside of the try, and then we can return those results in here. I think I need that and to get rid of this. All right, so that should be formatted a lot better. And then inside of here, what we'll return is a stringified version of our jobs. So inside of here, we're taking our data, we're stringifying that to JSON string, and then we're telling the API that we're responding back with application JSON data. So we can save this. This project is still running if you did multiple tabs. If it's not running, go and rerun it again. And then inside of our Postman tab, we already have this open, so we can rerun this again. And we get an error saying that the API key is required. And I think that's because we never restarted our server after those environment variables were set. So just so you know, or for you to see, Xata actually automatically created environment variables that we'll need to use to connect to our database when we did the codegen. So we created our branch variable and then our API key variable. Now, there's one more thing we actually need to do when we reference our client. So right now, Xata, the get Xata client function, is automatically looking for an environment variable called process.env Xata API key. But if we look in the documentation for Astro environment variables, it's using Vite. So environment variables are accessible at import.meta.env instead of process.env. So in this case, instead of using the get Xata client function from the Xata SDK, we are going to create a new Xata client directly ourselves. So we can call new Xata client, and this is going to get that import, and we can remove the previous one. And we can say new Xata client, and then pass in a config object for our API key and say this is going to come from import.meta.env.Xata API key. So now we have a Xata client that's configured with our actual API key. So from here, we should be able to test our endpoint again in Postman and hopefully now see all of our data. So if we look inside of here, we can see all of our jobs are being returned to us in this JSON response that we're able to test inside of here. Now, the next thing we want to do is define something very similar, but for a post request. So we want to have a post request where we can actually send a job to this API endpoint. So in this case, we can update this to be a post function. And inside of here, we'll want to reference our Xata or our client. Again, we'll do db.job.create, and then we need to pass in that job object. We'll get to that in a second, how to get that inside of our post endpoint. But from here, we'll assign this to a created job variable, and then we can return this. So we can actually copy the return that we did up here, and then we'll pass in this created job as the thing to be stringified and the JSON to be returned in this API endpoint. So the next step is to actually get the data that was submitted to this post request and pass it in as the object that we're creating in Xata. So from our parameter passed into our post request, we can actually destructure the request variable. Now, one additional thing we can do to get some TypeScript IntelliSense in here is define what sort of method this is. So we can define this as an API route, which then allows us to get IntelliSense for these properties. So this will look a little bit different, but we can export const and then post and then have an alias or like a definition for this as an API route, and then have our async definition. And then we'll use this as an arrow function. And this needs one more open bracket, so that should be good. And then we'll get an import for this. So this is importing from Astro above. So we get our API route, and then when we try to destructure our parameters, we should get IntelliSense for our actual request. Now we can get the body from the request by awaiting, and then we can take request.json. Again, we get the TypeScript IntelliSense in here. So this is going to get that body, and we can actually just call this a job. And in theory, longer term, we would do validation on all those properties and things. But for right now, let's just pass that into our function that is going to create that job inside of Xata. So let's go to our Postman client inside of VS Code. Let's test out a post, and we're going to send a post request to this same URL. So /API/jobs. Again, kind of neat that we can define both of these route handlers in the same file. And then what we're going to pass into this is raw data as the body, and we'll format this as JSON. So if we remember, what are the different properties that we need? Well, we need a company. So we can say the company is Xata again. And I'm going to copy the link from some of the sample data below. So let's do our link. We'll have the title be really cool developer. We'll have the type be full time. And if we have any questions of what all data we actually need for this, we can actually refer back to our Xata RC file, and we can look at these properties and see whether or not they are required. So we have our link, we have the company, we have the title, and we have the type. So I think we have everything we need inside of this request. So we'll send this post request. We'll go ahead and send it. And it sent us back a new record. So it looks like it created that thing. So let's actually go into our Xata table. And you see that this actually popped up by default. So it looks like I forgot the location, which I think was a new property. But we have everything else covered, which is pretty awesome. So we're able to handle post requests in here. Now, the next thing to do would be to handle update requests in here as well. So the next thing we might want to do is be able to delete one of these jobs records by its ID. So to be able to do this, we want to access the ID of the record inside of the route. So in this case, what we can do is create a new folder inside of jobs with a bracket syntax of ID. And then we can create an index.ts file inside of there. So what this basically means is we're able to send API requests to /API/jobs and then /ID. And then this is going to be our handler to be able to handle those incoming requests. So I'm going to copy over the definition for a delete request, and let's go and get our import for API route. And then what we'll want to get is the ID that we're looking for. And this is going to come from params.id. So that params thing that we destructured here. And then we'll use this inside of Xata. So we need to get a reference to this just like we did in our other file. So we'll get our Xata client. We'll copy and paste this over. And then we'll need to get the import for the Xata client. So we'll get that, and then we'll use this. So we'll take our client.db.job.delete and then pass in that ID. And this is going to be an asynchronous operation. So we'll await for that and then assign that to the deleted job because it returns the job that was deleted. And I think we're missing our async tag up here to be able to use the await. And then lastly, we can kind of mimic the return that we did before by returning this deleted job. So it looks like we have a little bit of a red error in this call. That's because this property may or may not be defined. So we can actually do a check on here. Like if there is no ID, we could return something else. So inside of here, we could return a new response. And we'll pass an object with an error that says ID is required. And then a status, and then a config object with a status of 400. And we'll need to stringify this object as well. So we'll pass in that whole object inside of the JSON stringify method. And so what this is saying is if we don't get back an ID, we want to make sure we return this. So we're not trying to query based on an ID that wasn't passed to us. Now there is also the potential that this will fail because this ID wasn't found. So there's some other use cases to handle, but let's just make sure this will work as well. So let's go back to our Postman request. And for that record that we just created, I want to copy that ID. And then what we're going to do is send a delete request to our API endpoint /API/jobs, and then paste in the ID of the record that we're looking to delete. So let's send this and just see what happens. So it looks like it sent the record back. If we then were to do a request and get all of the jobs, in theory, what we would see is that record is not included. Now this is a little hard to visualize. So let's go back here into the visual editor of Xata, and we can see that that last record has been deleted. Now, the last thing we might want to do, which is very similar to what we just did with delete, is to do an update of an existing item. So I'm going to copy a little bit of this code, and let's change this to a put instead of a delete. And then let's close out this tag. Let's copy over our check for the ID. So we're going to get the ID in the same exact way. We're going to double check that ID in the exact same way. And then let's copy and paste over our return of a response. And in this case, we want to get a reference to an updated job. So that's the thing that we're going to return after this update has taken place. And then lastly, we need two things. We need the ID and then also the actual body, which has the data inside of it that we want to update to. So to reference that, we've already done this. We can copy this part over. So we have the ID, then we want to get the body from the request. So we convert that to JSON, get that job. And then lastly, we're going to call our Xata client.db.job. And we'll call the update function. We'll pass in the ID of the job that we're updating, and then we'll pass in the job itself. So we should get back an updated job that gets returned in this API. So let's go back over to our Postman page. Let's flip this to a put request. We now have to make a put request to a job that already exists. So I'm going to copy an ID here. Let's do /API/job/ID. And then we will update that information with something else. So let's, I'm going to copy over this original information. So there's the link for this clerk job. And then I'm going to change this. Actually, nothing right now is called really cool developer job. So let's just do something like that. So all this should do is update the title of that role. So let's send this. Hopefully it does it update. It sends us the thing back. If we come back into the Xata editor and look at the title, we have a really cool developer job now, which is pretty neat. So all in all, we're able to create a fully RESTful REST API inside of Xata, leveraging API endpoints on the server. We can also integrate with our Xata database. We have TypeScript types. We talked about environment variables, but most importantly, we're able to handle each of these different functions, a get, a post, a put, and a delete, and we're able to organize these in a way that takes advantage of the file-based routing inside of Astro, which is pretty cool. Now, if you enjoyed Astro for what we did today, there's two additional resources you might go and check out. One is the free crash course that I have on YouTube that I talked about earlier. The other is my full Astro course at astrocourse.dev. So if you want to know everything in depth about Astro that you might want to know, This is a project this is a course that is perfect for you. If you kind of scroll down to the topics that are covered, there's some really cool stuff in here. We do all TypeScript. We do Astro components, integrations, islands. We do Markdown, content collections with Zod, dynamic routes. And then when we get to the server side part, we do API routes, form submissions, using Xata again, building an auth strategy, and a few other things, which is a ton of fun. So if you're interested in learning more about Xata, check out the crash course on my YouTube channel, or check out the full course at astrocourse.dev. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to stay up to date with the things that I'm doing on a weekly basis, make sure to check out my newsletter at jamesqquick.com/newsletter. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.